You have heard in the news undoubtedly about the train that derailed over a month ago in East Palestine, Ohio. Norfolk Southern government officials and others don't seem to agree on whose fault the crash was or what the impact has been or will be on the people or environment. The people of East Palestine have been reporting headaches, coughs, rashes, vomiting, and other classic symptoms of chemical exposure. The Ohio Department of Natural Resources reported that an estimated 3,500 fish were found dead within the 7 miles of stream nearby in the first 5 days after the crash. For a while, the residents were advised only to drink bottled water, but that has since been lifted. Clean, safe water for cooking, drinking, bathing has been recognized as a human right by the United Nations. A human being can only survive or can survive for weeks without food, but only for a few days without water. About 65% of our bodies, including our blood and brains, is water. More deaths result from illnesses caused by lack of drinking water and sanitation than by war. And globally, about 1 in 8 people still lack potable water. So while many of us are privileged enough to consider the plight of the Israelites in the desert an ancient one, or the water of which Jesus and the Samaritan woman talked to be purely metaphorical, access to water remains essential for life and a pressing concern for millions, even in the United States. We have 2 rich and lengthy scripture passages today that center around water. Need for it, access to it, and God's role in providing it. Both passages also involve people in a landscape that is difficult, new, or wild. The Israelites are in the midst of their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, and in a particular place that seems to not even have water for them to drink. Jesus finds himself outside of Jerusalem and outside of the Israelite territories in Samaria, a land of foreigners. Samaritans were also Jewish, but an ethnically distinct tribe, and there were long-standing tensions between these groups. We also find people in both passages wrestling with faith, and in particular, the question of where God is, and if God could be with them in this difficult and parched wilderness terrain. Moses, hearing the complaints of these people, passes the complaints on to God and asks what he should do. God, of course, shows up for Moses and for the people in revealing to them and making possible the provision of water. And the woman at the well has an encounter with Jesus that transforms her faith and her understanding of God. There's also a similarity in these passages in the idea of God dwelling amongst the people. When the temple fell to the Babylonians, Israel asked, where could God be now? The priestly writers responded by fashioning this tradition called the tabernacle tradition that we see in this wilderness story. As Israel lived in the uncertainty between exile and home, the people needed assurance that the Lord did not perish in the temple's fall, but rather they came to know that God dwells in a moving, fragile home, not made with stones. But that while the community faced great upheaval, God was not in the physical buildings or institutions that fell, but rather living in and among the weary travelers, in a holy tent that traveled alongside them. And biblical scholar Frederick Niedner writes that in John's gospel, Christian theologians find a link between that tabernacling God and the divine absence that humankind knows amidst terrible thirst. In the prologue to the Gospel of John, the writer speaks of the Word made flesh that dwelled, and literally this is the same word for tabernacle, so that dwelled or tabernacled among us in a moving, fragile embodiment of God's glory. So in this way, we see that the same theme from the Hebrew Bible present in our understanding of Jesus in the New Testament. To a community that has been upended, God shows up in an unexpected and untethered form in order to accompany humanity more closely. And in both stories, the God that dwells among us is a source of life. For the Israelites, literally making water burst forth from a rock, and in John's gospel, asserting that Jesus is living water. Not only does God provide water, but water is divine. So it's not a coincidence that the lack of water prompts people in ages past and still today to wonder where God is. Wherever people thirst for the safety and security of life's essentials, people wonder whether God is with them. Wherever people are outside of their comfort zones, in unfamiliar terrain, we wonder whether God is there. Whether our uncertainty is physical, emotional, or political, we seek the security of the presence of the divine to guide us to safety, to show us a wellspring of hope. What wilderness are you finding yourself in this Lent? Amongst this gathered body, there are those of us facing a wilderness of health concerns for ourselves or others, those of us facing financial uncertainty or professional change, those of us facing the wilderness of caregiving with inadequate structures of support, many in the wilderness of grief, others facing deserts of mental health challenges or loneliness, and more of us still feeling tossed about by the big winds of change in our political systems, even in our church life and in other institutions. In all of our wildernesses, where will we find sources of living water to sustain our journeys? For the ancients, as for today, water was essential for life. And the Roman Empire, the backdrop for the Gospels, was known for and built upon its water systems. Mitzi Smith, the womanist biblical scholar and professor, reminds us that Rome was the first vast city characterized by its management of drinking water. They were famous for their aqueducts that carried water via natural gravity nonstop to Roman cities. The aqueducts ensured a steady, continuous flow of water to public baths and lavish fountains, as well as for private homes that could afford to pay taxes on the spigot. So water itself was free, but customers of piped water paid for the delivery of water into their homes. To the average Roman resident, water in the city was available by right, as free for the taking as water from the Tiber River. And while the urban population had access to public water supply through huge elaborately decorated water basins, people living in rural areas, like the Samaritan woman, had access to water via cisterns and wells. Lacus, or public water basins, were placed in Roman cities for the benefit of the public who would gather as at a well to draw water freely. And the number of lacus increased exponentially under Emperor Augustus. Augustus made an indelible political statement, increasing public water access in this way. As the first emperor after the murder of Julius Caesar, this gesture served as a reminder to the common people that they received the water from imperial beneficence in the name of their ruler. The Romans' right to water was acknowledged, ensured, and enhanced as aqua nomine Caesaris, water in the name of Caesar. So perhaps then, Jesus' claim of being the source and provider of living water was a counter-offer to the flowing waters of Rome. While Caesar's water was nominally free, it required the subjugation of many. Its enjoyment came with strings attached, and it was a hierarchical system of access. In other words, it had a cost. Jesus, on the other hand, is providing water in the name of God, given by God for all people for free, particularly the marginalized and those in the wilderness, in stark contrast to the flowing waters of Rome arranged to the advantage of the elite. Is water a divine gift and source of connection with the divine? Or is it a product, subject to the mercies of political dynasties and corporate power? in our personal wildernesses. We can become confused or tempted into believing that the source of our hope and sustenance will be products, systems or things we can buy, or perhaps a place we could go that will change it all. But if we really understand that God is here, wherever here is, that God is our source, and that all we need for flourishing is free, perhaps there we may find our own living waters. In this interaction with Jesus, the Samaritan woman came to know him as a prophet, one who knew her full story beyond the number of husbands that she had, and came to know Jesus as the source of living water. She comes to know God who dwells outside the temple, has joined her in the desert, and offers her hope that God's promise of living water for all people will one day be a reality. The people of places like Flint and East Palestine and countless places around the globe are still waiting for that day. And perhaps we too, in the parts of ourselves that thirst for God's presence in our wildernesses, or in our desire for the flourishing of humanity, are also waiting for this living water. Is the Lord among us? We are reminded that God does not dwell only in the temple or only at the spigots of the wealthy, but rather joins us in our wilderness, meets us at the well. And perhaps we, like the woman Jesus met there, might decide to leave our jar unexpectedly open to the presence of the Spirit and the promise of living water for all.